Hey there, awesome friends. This is Klaire, and I'm going to teach you how to make a Thunderdomesticity patch. You don't need any prior sewing experience because I will show you all the steps. You can use this patch to repair a hole in clothing, create a costume, or to enhance your post-apocalyptic style artwork. This fiber art tutorial is part of the curriculum at the Unaccredited College of Klaire, which is my very affordable and slightly absurd art school on patreon.com/Klaire Lockheart. You can sign up for my mailing list or experience various art making demonstrations by joining UCK. Just search for me, Klaire Lockheart, at Patreon. Thunderdomesticity is a combination of Thunderdome and domesticity, and it's an art series that I developed with artist Aaron C. Packard. I create post-apocalyptic costumes, which Aaron photographs, and this is to express our displeasure with the traditional mistreatment of women. We're carving out a space to celebrate the strength of women and people of other marginalized genders with our art, and I would personally like to invite you to participate. I'm showing you how to create a patch so you can start making your own post-apocalyptic mid-century feminine archetypical costume, or so you can make your own Thunderdomesticity style art. To make this patch, you'll need the following materials. First, you need a Thunderdomesticity pattern. You also need fabric, and I recommend using canvas, but any fabric will work. You also need thread, a needle, sewing scissors, and pins. I recommend sewing with a thimble, and you might want to have a pencil handy. The first thing I need to do is cut out all my pieces to create the patch. You'll notice I have selected two different types of fabric. For the skull and the bow, I'm using a regular scrap of canvas fabric that I had on hand. And then for the backing, for the bouffant, I'm using black canvas. I have found that stiff fabric, sturdier fabric like upholstery fabric and canvas works the best, but you are welcome to test out whatever materials you have available. I also want you to notice that I have printed two different patterns. It's the same pattern, I just cut out the skull and the bow off the second one to make my life a little easier when I'm creating this. You are welcome to use the patterns that I have prepared for you or create your own. I want to make sure that my pattern stays in place when I'm cutting, so I am going to pin my pattern down to my fabric. This will help hold it in place and make my life easier when I try to cut this out. Now, I would like to show you a different technique on the smaller pattern piece. When you are cutting out patterns, sometimes it's easier to trace it. And typically I would recommend using a chalk or tailor's pencil to trace around your pattern pieces, but with such light fabric, this won't show up. So it is possible just to use a regular pencil. I want my pencil marks to be on the back of my pattern, so I'm just going to flip my pattern pieces over. That way all my marks will be on the back side of my fabric. My fabric is the same on the front and back, so I don't need to flip my fabric over. But if you're using a printed or a pattern fabric that's different, make sure you do this on the underside if you want to use this technique. I am just going to hold my pattern in place as best I can. You can pin this down too if you want, but with really small pieces like this bow, pinning doesn't work so well, or at least not for me. So I'm just going to trace around the edges. And one of the nice things about this project is you want your patch to look handmade. You don't want them all to look the same. And so imperfections in your tracing or your cutting are actually really good for creating this patch. And once I have these tiny pieces traced, I'm going to be ready to cut everything out. When I am ready, I will cut all the pieces of fabric I need for my patch. You'll notice that when I cut the skull out of the cloth, I cut the outer edge first, and then I cut the holes for the eye sockets and nose. I fold the fabric in half to make a little snip with my scissors, and then I remove the negative space with my scissors. Once again, it's okay if you don't match the pattern perfectly. I often don't use a set pattern when I'm creating the patches for my Thunderdomesticity costuming, especially when I'm making very large or very small patches. The proportions will vary, and that helps add character to this fiber art project. After I cut out all of my pieces, I am going to pin everything in place. So I want to align my patch. If you traced your pieces like I did, just flip them over so they're on the back side. And I just want to line everything up before I pin it down to make sure I like the positioning. I'm actually going to not bother to put the bow in place because it's really small and the skull is more important right now, but I want to set that aside so I don't lose it. And then I'm going to pin the skull down where I want it to be. So that way when I'm sewing, it'll help stay in position. And depending on how big or how small your patch is, that will determine how many pins you'll need to hold everything in place. I need to thread my needle next, and if it's been a while since you've done any sewing or you don't have any sewing experience at all, that's okay. I'll show you all the steps. First, pick out a needle that will work best for you, and then select your thread. I like using unexpected color combinations and using thread left over from other projects. That way it really looks like I am doing some scavenging in the post-apocalypse. Threading a needle can be kind of difficult, so I'm going to show you a trick that works for me. First of all, I'm going to snip off the edge of my thread so I have a clean edge. This will make it easier to put into the needle. Then I hold my thread so it's between my index finger and thumb, and just a tiny bit of it is poking out. After that, I can shove that thread into the eye of my needle. Sometimes I might need to wiggle it a little bit to make it go through. Once I have the thread through the needle, I'm going to pull it to the desired length. Now when I sew, I like to have my thread doubled up. So once I decide how long I want it, I will remove it from the spool, and I hold the two edges of thread together like it's just one piece, but it's just twice as strong. To tie the knot at the end, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I'm holding both pieces together, and then I will loop it around. So I'm going to create a little loop with the thread with the double edges overlapping this curve. Pretending I'm just using one piece of thread and tying a knot in it, I'm going to take those edges and poke it through the loop. And I'm essentially just wrapping the thread around itself. I'm going to expand this so you can see it a little better. I'm kind of making a tiny little pretzel with my thread. And once I have it with the edges pulled through the loop, I'm going to pull gently until my knot is formed. Now, I do have a lot of floppy thread beyond the edge of my knot, so I'm going to trim that down so it's about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I don't want my knot too close to the edge because it'll probably come undone when I am sewing. Once my needle is threaded, I am ready to begin sewing. I want to make sure my pattern is in place, And when I sew, I like to use a thimble. I'll wear it on the middle finger of my dominant hand, not because I like to give rude gestures, but because when I sew, I will use the edge of the thimble to push the needle through the fabric. That way the back of the needle doesn't stab me in my fingertips as I'm going. Once I know that my pattern is positioned the way I want it, I'm going to double check and make sure that the knot is at the edge of my thread, and I'm going to start from the back so that way my knots are concealed. It's okay to start from the front too if you're worried about alignment. It's not a big deal. But I'm going to start with the nasal cavity. I want to start with the smaller inside holes first because the fabric will stretch and flex, and it just makes everything lay down a lot flatter for me. So I'm going to begin by pushing my needle through the back of my patch to the front. I'm going in the backing fabric, so the black fabric. I'll pull the needle through, and I'm going to make sure that I keep some of that thread poking out the back. This knot won't be enough to hold it. So I'll show you how to get started on that. I'm going to take my thread and poke it through the overlapping fabric, so the skull part, and gently pull it until I have the stitch on the front flat. And then there's going to be a little bit of your thread hanging out on the back, and there'll be a little tiny loop. So what I'm going to do is take my needle and poke it through that loop underneath the knot. I'm going to make sure that I'm catching on the knot of the thread, and then I'll gently pull that tight. That's going to anchor all my stitches in place. Now, as you're working, your fabric may come unfrayed like this, and that's completely okay because it's going to indicate that handmade quality. I am going to stitch through around this nose. So I'll poke the needle through the back, through the nasal cavity, pull the needle through the front. I want to make sure there's no hanging threads, and then poke it through that overlapping fabric. So I'm attaching the skull to that backing fabric. And it's a good idea to start off with a shorter piece of thread because it can get kind of tangled and you don't want to get too frustrated as you're sewing. And the further apart you put your stitches, the more the fabric can come undone. And you can sew really nice and close if you want to try and prevent that. You can even attempt to do this on a sewing machine if you want. But the fun part about this project is that it does celebrate the handiwork of the people making it. So it's okay to show that there are flaws in it, and it's really that indication that you are making this entirely by hand. Also, sometimes it's fun just to stab something over hundreds of times. Maybe I shouldn't say that part out loud. Anyway, I'm going to keep going, and I will show you how to tie the knot at the end. I'm keeping my stitching kind of loose because I do like that undone quality. It gives it a fun texture, especially when you're seeing this work from a distance. It does exaggerate and make it more theatrical. But once I have enough stitching done, and it's okay if you run out of thread before you're done with a shape. But when you get to a point where you're worried you won't have enough thread to keep going, you'll tie a knot on the back. And what I'm going to do is just take my needle and poke it through the last stitch I made. And this is going to create a little arc or a little loop. And what I'm going to do is take my needle and poke that through. So once again, I'm creating that pretzel shape, and then just gently pull it tight. I do like to double knot it because I do not want my stitching to come undone because I'm putting a lot of effort into this. And you want sturdy handiwork in the post-apocalypse. So I'm going to poke it through that stitch again. I'm creating a loop. I'll poke my needle through that and then gently pull tight. And when I have that, I'm going to snip off the thread. I don't want it too close to the edge of the knot because I don't want to cut in the knot on accident. And I want to make sure that it stays in place. Sewing can be a time-consuming process, which is why I am going to speed up my demonstration. I want you to observe how I sew so you'll feel comfortable when you create your own fiber art. I'd like to reiterate that I begin by sewing the nose cavity and eye sockets first before attaching the perimeter of the skull. I'm doing this because the fabric will shift and stretch, and it's easier for me to get the final composition to lay flat if I start in the middle. I also want to emphasize that it's okay if your stitching isn't perfect or the fabric unravels a little. You want this patch to look like it was made by hand, and if you don't have a lot of experience sewing, that's perfect for the Thunderdomesticity aesthetic. Once you have attached the skull to the hairdo, then you can add the bow. You'll use the same technique as before to sew the bow to the hair. After you have attached the skull and the bow to the bouffant, you can sew your awesome new patch directly to your clothing to repair a hole, or you can use it to create a costume. You can also incorporate it into your artwork. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn how to create a Thunderdomesticity patch. I'd love to see your costumes and creations. I hope you'll be able to participate in one of my Thunderdomesticity events. To find more art making tutorials and resources, please head over to patreon.com/Klaire Lockheart to join the Unaccredited College of Klaire.